It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Bee Scherer, who's going to introduce the work of a new research centre in the university called INCISE, which is for the Intersectional Centre for Inclusion and Social Justice, which hopefully will resonate at least with a number of the issues that we've already begun to think about. Bee.
Thank you.
So hello everybody. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today and talk a little bit about INCISE. I'd also talk maybe and preach to the converted here as somebody who is a very strong postmodern social constructivist about social justice in its intersection with mental health. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about this, and then if I have the time, zoom in into some area of my theoretical research on transfeminism. I'm looking at an example of trans mental health, of how this is intersecting with social justice issues. Now, the new Intersectional Centre for Inclusion and Social Justice is looking across university, the different aspects of social individual identity, performance, and expression, including but not limited to gender, sexualities, religion, ethics and faith, health, mental health, disability. You will later hear that I'm not using this term anymore, but prefer talking about variability, and things such as socioeconomic justice and sustainability. If you want to know a little bit more about our programs and our works, please go to this very easy website, incise.center. Just remember, the center domain is American spelling, not British. So some of the things that we're doing is chiming in with race ethnicity, with Black History Month. Tomorrow we have an event. We have our launch event on Friday that looks more at the intersection of religion and queer theory. And then in religion and social justice we have a focus on Islam this year. So fortnightly seminars and lectures on aspects of Islamic civilizations as they intersect with various markers of social justice and identity. But maybe I should now first introduce, for those of you who are a bit confused about the term intersectionality, what this actually means. Now, when we talk about intersectionality, then we acknowledge that when we approach social justice, we need to take into consideration what centric in queer theory is called the open mesh of complex, multi-angle, what I call blurred, or what others call hybrid, muddy and messy identitarian facets, or markers of identity, you could say, through a multiplicity or polyphony of reflexive lenses. And so we're trying to provide foundational underpinnings to transdisciplinary, multi-methodological identity and social justice scholarship, flowing on to policy making and activism. So although I'm talking like a typical ivory tower person, I'm completely wedded to academia being activism. You cannot be an academic and not be an activist at the same time when you work around these issues. So the term intersectionality, as it's developed in the 1990s by Crenshaw and others, recognizes that monofocal approaches to entangled individual social issues do not always yield analysis sufficiently complex to create the kind of new knowledges and understanding needed for high impact scholarship and activism. So that's it's one of the reasons I'm a professor apparently, because I make very easy things very complicated sounding. So that's what. So we look at different with lots of different angles on very complex issues, and we're not trying to make them simpler than they are. Okay, so parameters here that are important for intersectionalities and are focusing in on mental health problems are things such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, class, migration status, economic status, all these kind of areas that we can fragment our identities in, and then we inflate them sometimes and say, well, with that, but actually it's just always a mosaic stone of a messy, muddy, changing, fluid, hybrid creation of identities from moment to moment. Talking about mental health, I think the key approach here, preaching to the converted, is that mental health is not an individual problem. It's simply not. Mental health is a social issue. It's justice issue. So what happened in, let's say, the development of positivist approaches to health, pathologizing, medicalizing models, is that the onus was taken away from the collective, from the society, and placed on an individual who has experienced something that is askance to normalcy. However, this is constructed, and because the construction of normalcy, I call it oppressive normalcy. It's the construction of the center which creates a margin. So, countering this insidious shift in the discourse from we are taking responsibility for the systemic injustice in our society to, well, it's your problems, and we, if we are feeling very generous, we might support you in that. Yeah? This is what happens in the medical pathologizing discourse. But the real issue in many areas, and I'm not talking about crisis intervention here, I'm talking about the systemic issues that are building up to the manifestation, to the phenomenology, you could say, of mental distress. So these systemic issues are simply consequences of oppressive understandings of normalcies, or we could say normativities. Oppressive normalcy. So we see that in a discourse connected to mental health, which we could call the disability discourse. For me, disability discourse, already talking about disability, whether it's some physical or mental health disability, is already disabling, because the dis takes away from the fullness of human potential. So at the moment, an impairment, an obstacle that you encounter in life becomes a disadvantage, something that takes something away, becomes a disability. So, and very often disability discourses use not reflected arbitrary body normativities and neuronormativities that clash with the variety, the huge variability, variety of embodied experiences and neurodiversities. You see that very often in discussions about autism and other spectral attempts to categorization of people. Without me being on some spectrum, I probably wouldn't be a professor, But that's then a positive thing somehow. For other people, that's then a negative thing. So it's completely arbitrary. But what philosophically and culturally critically is behind it is this idea that Lakoff called the prototype theory. Now, this is the idea that we are creating in our mind centers, ideals of discourses. Now, discourses related to power, discourses related to typicality. This is what's called prototype theory. Now, in the moment we do that, we have, this should be essentialized, so I don't know what it is, essentialized. In that moment, we essentialize an ideal that actually nobody is ever embodying, but that people are aiming to be as close as possible to. This essentialized idea that bestows some form of power, some form of privilege. Now, in our society, this ideal is white, is male, is cisgendered, is heterosexual, is young to early middle age, is able-bodied, is neurotypical, is good-looking, and I could add to that, and to that, and to that. And so we are gauging each other's identities, performances in our distances to this projected ideal center, and create sort of hierarchies of privilege and power according to that. So if you can perform very closely to that prototype, you have a tremendous advantage of power and privilege. If you can't, you are disadvantaged and marginalized. Now, since this social participation and social power has an effect on mental health, on mental distress, on psychological power, we can call it, let's say, participation in psychosocial power, and the question of how empowered we are in this discourse. Now, some people are naturally advantaged. I'm very privileged with the color of my skin, which is completely arbitrary. I'm unprivileged in different areas, you know. So, and then it's in situation, and depending on the situations, I experience privileging and disprivileging, and I can experience certain distress or the opposite, whatever that is, of euphoria of power or whatever, you know, in other experiences. Now, obviously, the point here is that the creation of this prototype is the problem. And how people then, embodied people, use this to actually hawk, is that the English word? Yeah, to hawk power and privilege. Yeah. So it's no wonder why a white cisgendered affluent male like Donald Trump is dismissing his misogynistic, borderline criminal behavior with the full power of his privilege, you know? If you would have a different marginalized group exposing this kind of behavior, they would already probably be charged in a prison. You know? So this is... Now, what is happening that the center of the prototype creates the margins, and margins we can also talk about abjections. That is... in the case of centric, binary, cisgender masculinities, the production of patriarchal bias, sexism, cisgenderism, transphobia. In the case of racial and or religious elite constructions, we got white privilege, white supremacy, racism, colorism, casteism, religious monotheisms. We have in the compulsory heterosexuality, producing homo, lesbo, queerophobia. We have able-bodied discourses creating ableism, and so on. You get the gist. All this is only aiding those who can perform in some relationship to the ideal well and pool of power and privilege. Yeah? So it is we are if we perform like that, if we are not reflecting our privilege, then we are actually being seduced by the creation of identity through exclusion. As if our identity performance and our expression would always only be necessarily produced through the exclusion of others. And this is what I think needs to be challenged. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of how we could challenge this. Now, so instead, at one point in the area of mental health and disability is to stop talking about disability. Start talking about what my friend Chris Mounsey has called variability. Variability as the acknowledgement that everyone is same, only in different ways. So we get rid of these straitjackets. Interesting, yeah, good word actually. Societal straitjackets, and that tell us to perform identity in a certain prototypical way and acknowledge the sameness, only differences of our bodily, embodied, and mental performances. So, acknowledging impairment obstacles does not need to lead to disability. So without center and margin, any variable expression, be that bodily or mentally, retains autonomy of its own embodied presence. So we don't need to exclude through our identity performance. I hope I made this a little bit clear. I mean, there's a lot of phobias around that we unnecessary. Anyway, I might come back to that. So, what this means then, accepting and celebrating variability. If we have understood there is no center in margin, there's just humanity, human variability. So, then we don't need to feel ontologically insecure by the occurrence of different expressions of identity. It doesn't need to shake our core, because we got rid of what we should be, the center. Most of us will never, or all of us will never be the center. Yeah? But what we've got rid of. Instead, we can just say, well, rhizomatically, there's variability and we celebrate that. So variably performed embodiment flowing from time and space and context and situation rather than a center or ideal to look for. And that way we get rid of the production of oppressive normativity, especially body normativity. So sorry for all the jargon. So let's have a look at an example, if I have time. Okay. An example of trans mental health. Now, it's an interesting example in the sense of that there is some societal discourse around trans embodiment with vast segments of society still finding transphobic statements completely acceptable. You know, if you look at the much hailed new head of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, you know, who moved a little bit the battlefield in the area of LGBT, lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, but made a very, very strict and firm new border there for trans. Trans being a sinful embodiment of everything that goes against God's plan, you know, and that's acceptable in the 21st century still. So, people turning around and saying, well, trans people are mentally ill in themselves. Right. Well, I would say they're all mentally distressed at some point in their life, and so, I mean, but you know, you see this essentializing of a whole group of people. And that is, in the medical model, reflected still in the pathologization of gender identity variance as this, again, terrible word, gender dysphoria. So the last DSM still talks about gender dysphoria, although there is an opening now in the new one to maybe look more on the experience of discontent or distress rather than on the experience in itself of gender identity variance. My argument, and that of other trans feminists, is very clearly that trans mental health issues are the direct result, and very clear result, of oppressive normalcy. So in that sense, trans issues are a very, very, very good example for what I try to tell you about the social justice approach to mental health. If I do a meta-analysis of recent surveys in the global north, then we have actually terrible results to report on trans mental health. Yeah? The prevalences on, with regard of prevalences of depression, suicidal attempts, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, drug use, and more direct forms of discrimination and violence. So I won't go through all the statistics, but let me just give me if you just have like have a visual imprint of all these data, you can appreciate the high prevalence, the higher than in other groups, of rather destructive, self-destructive behavior. Now, again, when you go more into qualitative details, participants would actually make very clear that the things they are feeling distressed about is the societal reaction. Every day is, I'll give you an example. When the Brexit vote came, which is very funny, as an EU national, friends said to me, well, I feel so very unwelcome now when I'm going across the street, because I know that 50% of these people, they won't want me here anymore, and I don't speak Polish or Dutch or whatever I speak anymore in the streets, because I'm afraid people will be antagonistic towards me. So, oh yeah, I guess that's right. But when I haven't really thought about that. My reaction was that because when I'm going over the street, I always expect to be beaten up. So okay, yeah. So what does this continuous, due to societal oppression, this continuous state of hypervigilance, what does that do actually to the individual? So that is a result in mental distress, and can become a full-blown mental illness, of course, or an episode. Or you just, like this. Anyway, so just think about that, all of a sudden, some characteristic that you can't hide is something that makes you almost afraid to go over the street, across the street, without being beaten up. So this is what the statistics tell us. Health services, extraordinary schools, when we talk about young people experience at work. But I was very lucky that I have this resilience, and other people don't have that, So that we see in the statistics on poverty, which is this gap of a higher education versus poverty, which we have in the Canadian study, is absolutely astonishing. Anyway, family violence. I don't want to go to all of that, mindful of the time. But it is clear from these meta-analysis that trans people experience discrimination, harassment on a daily basis, most places. And that results in some quite substantial mental distress, I guess. And you cannot always take it humorously, I assume. So prevalence of IPV, violence, intimate partner violence, suicide attempts, and so on. And for me, this is a stark illustration of how mental health is directly linked to things we don't discuss very often. That has to do with the structure and the system our society works. We've become so complacent about things taken for granted, including democracy, as if democracy really would work. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this weird referendum. I guess it's a good example for how it doesn't work. So we don't have these discussions anymore. Well, the thing is, Zizek recently said that capitalism and democracy will split, and I see late capitalism and democracy have to split at this point from the logic of late capitalism. So my answer would not be, well, okay, yeah, let's all get rid of democracy, but get back to a post-Marxist or neo-Marxist of model and reform and like this. But anyway, this is my leftist cloud cuckoo talk, so you can completely disagree with me on that. But look, I hope I made an argument for you is to see how important it is to take a social justice view on issues that society will tell you are individual issues. It's your burden. Oh, you're having a psychotic episode. Yeah, well, okay, it's the burden is on you. Yeah, we might help you a little bit, because we're so great. But what is it actually that produces it systemically? Are we stopping? Yeah? It's not, if home secretaries don't think before they speak and they want to introduce the blue yellow star again for everybody to wear or something like that, that means this is systemically something that is that can have very distressing consequences. Anyway, so now one important factor, just as a trans feminist, in all this is what is a specific insidious form of normalcy, which we can call patriarchy or heteropatriarchy, that has to do with male, cis, binary, white entitlement and privilege. And that actually produces hegemonic masculinity with phallocracy. And I have been publishing and thinking as a cultural critic on the way that is actually working and producing, in various degrees, mental distress in the form of sexism, heterosexuality. I really see somebody's running for president. This terrible example of that. Homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. It's all has to do with power and privilege, what Lacan calls the phallus, so male power and privilege. So I call it a phallophobia, consider that's a funny name, it's a weird name. Coming up with these names basically, these terms basically keeps me from the street, so that's good. So if you disagree with this, at least you don't see me going around and shouting at telephone boxes or something. So I usually don't do that, but I do hug the occasional tree. Anyway, so we have that in this. We have to acknowledge the intersection or the interpellation of these kind of oppressive normalcies, sexism, homophobia being intrinsically linked in this nexus of male privilege and power, and that. And in its end, when we're talking about the trans issue, what it boils down to it's an insidious logic of two steps. First of all, the human gender lexicon is binary. There are only zeros and ones. You're either pink or blue. Yeah? And we decide that sometimes with a measuring tape, with intersex people, with a measuring tape at the moment of birth. And then we have this attributed. So, and then the second step is even more insidious. They say, well, we have zeros and ones, but we have to put one in the beginning. Yeah, so one is better than the other. Oh, let's see. Well, male, female. Let's say male is better than female. So that's it. That's all there is to patriarchy. That's all there is. And because it's so arbitrary, it has to reassert itself again and again and again. It's not a natural thing. It's something that is performed through societal structures, through systemic structures. Again and again and again, male privilege. And that means that masculinity, understood in this way, is intrinsically fragile. It can never be, just be. It always has to perform. It always has to show that it's hierarchically better than being female. So hegemonic masculinity, therefore, feels constantly threatened. And one of the biggest threats to hegemonic masculinity is to threat this two-step logic that is behind there. First of all, the people, the weird people, the queer theorists and the feminists, the trans feminists, not all feminists, unfortunately, but let's say the queer feminists and the trans feminists saying, well, actually, gender is not one or is not male or female. It's just a spectrum, like sexuality is a spectrum. And then the other thing is, what all feminists then do is say, even if there are some feminists who believe in male and female as essential categories, that they all kind of agree, well, okay, that's very arbitrary to say that male is better than female. So, in that sense, the very existence of trans people threatens on multiple levels this model of hegemonic masculinity, of heteropatriarchy. Because if there are trans people, or non-binary people, even worse, then it threatens the essential stiffness of this binarism, and also the given male privilege. And this is why the expression of transphobia is so particularly violent, is so particularly violent. So, because trans then symbols, in the case of MTF, the loss of the phallus, of the male privilege, or the usurpation of the phallus in the terms of FTM, female to male, or the subversion, anarchic indifference, or uncertainty to the phallus in the form of androgeneity, genderqueerness, non-binary trans people. So, in that sense, trans is the nuclear threat to orthodox masculinity, and so there's somewhat complicated ways of saying the same thing on the board. So you would say, well, everybody understands that, but then lo and behold, we have all of the sudden, we have segments of also marginalized communities who would say, well, we actually just want to have a share of the power. We just want to replace the center rather than decentering everything and getting rid of all the margins. And there you have homonormativity, segments of the LGBT and T community who simply mimic, in the form of mimicry, or Homi Baba talked about mimicry also in post-colonialism. It's sort of mimic this oppressive normalcy, just with slight changes. Or you have trans exclusive radical feminists who basically believe so much on the binary, they just want to switch it around. And they think that actually trans people, especially male to female trans people, are usurping not the male privilege, but the female privilege, or especially the lesbian female. So, what does it mean? It means for heteropatriarchy can just sit back and say, well, look, we win. We have our center, and the margins, they are squabbling with themselves, and actually they all want to come into the center, and we are the gatekeepers, and we are holding them back, the way forward is to actually be more radical. Explode the system. Just blow it up. When there's no center, there's no margin anymore. When you think you're in the center just because you're white and male and heterosexual and, and able-bodied, well, think again, You're just as variable as everybody else. I mean, possibly being heterosexual and male might also be, a disability. So, if we accept the variabilities in all forms, body, neuro, gender, sexuality, variability, and challenge passivization of non-normative embodiments, and that means also a wide spectrum of autisms, for instance, of neurodiversity. What is everybody so afraid of neurodiversity? I mean, if I see somebody hugging a tree, I want to go and also hug a tree. It's not a big problem. What's the problem? Deconstructing privilege and power, celebrating human embodiment with no center or margin, and then you can only do that if you educate, and you educate to embrace variability rather than enable people to choose identities that exclude. So on this center, I think there is room to build a society based on these centers, truly human sameness and different, and not on hierarchies derived from prototypes and deviations. So I think I leave it with that. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got time for a couple of questions. Would you like to ask a question? Yes.
Did you say who was writing about variability versus disability?
Well, the term was coined by my friend Chris Mounsey, and then I think I'm one of the only persons at the moment who's been taking that up. So in my writing you will find the references also. Yeah. So we had, when we had Queer in Paradigm 6 there, where you also shared, Chris was there, who is a variable person. He has an impairment, he's blind. Actually now in the Queer in Paradigm 6 book that I then edited, we have a whole section also talking about queer/variable and developing that a little bit more.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I don't know. But in a way, isn't it really kind of like difficult to tackle all of these issues when it's so deeply intertwined with capitalism?
Yeah.
That's a huge force that's like constantly reinforcing insecurities and reinforcing a certain identity.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, late capitalism is what's driving us, including the university. You couple that normally with neoliberalism, and then you get, the only thing is what we can do is Foucauldian resistance or subversion. Yeah. I think that's the way forward, pragmatically.
I was to say, I went to school in the 70s, and actually, 60s and 70s, and it was very bigoted, and if anyone was gay or lesbian, they pretty much kept it to themselves, and it must have been a terrible time for anyone that felt that they were a bit different. But my children go to school now, and they often come home and say, oh yeah, we have a couple of transgender kids in our school, we've got, there's a couple of gays in my class. So I just think that from that, the fact that they're openly saying that, very accepted, I think things are very slowly moving in a better direction, definitely from my childhood.
I would love to think that, and anecdotally, I think that's true. But the weird pessimist that I am is, I don't believe in Hegelian visions of progression at all, because I've seen rights being granted and being taken away, and I've seen the pendulum swinging like this and like this, and the moment people, groups become complacent the moment things that we fought for are being taken away. And the worst thing is the fragmentation. You know, people now was everybody so about same-sex marriage? You know, I mean, yeah, great, wonderful. It's just a question of equality, but at the same time, then people get the idea, oh, we fought for that, we have that now, so everything is great. But everything is not great. You know, there's still a lot of homophobic murders going on, and there's still a lot of violence going on, and there's still insidious prejudices going on, and so those of us who are have little privilege, and well, I'm not. But with those who have the privilege to have like a white picket fence and a homonormative way of living, you know, mimicking heteronorms, they don't see what is going on, especially if you go into intersections, you know, with ethnicity, with class, and so on. So I'm very, yes, there are segments where where it's not a big deal anymore. Some things are not big deals anymore, but other things are big deals still, you know. And in others, so I wouldn't say it's time for complacency at all. I think, and no, you didn't say that, but I think well.
Do you not think that this education about mental health and variability and all that you said, we should have it in school, in secondary school? You know, our young people, our children, should have some knowledge so that as they progress in life.
Absolutely, but I mean, in this country, it's already hard to talk about sex to youngsters in school, you know, as the rates of teenage pregnancies will tell you. I mean, so if we have already a systemic failure of sex education, you know, I'm very pessimistic, especially with the agenda that is being driven by the majority government at the moment, that we will actually achieve anything there. But yes, we would need to start talking about privilege in a very early age. Yeah. About racism, about heteropatriarchy, all these kind of things. You know. Not going to happen.
Any final questions?
Sorry, prove me wrong. I said. Okay, sorry.
It did remind me some of the ideas around this creation of a centre and then margins, or a centre and then people excluded from different things. If we think about the history of care for people with mental illness and look at things like St Augustine's Hospital on the outskirts of Canterbury, I think it was, used to lock in hundreds of people who had mental health needs. Some of them didn't, some of them had labels such as moral defective. But they used to be locked in, and like with many other large Victorian asylums, they began to be closed down in the move to so-called community care, that people would be supported to live in the community. Nobody checked whether the community was ready to live with its mentally ill, but that's what happened. These large hospitals closed down. And if you look at St Augustine's now, it's a large luxury housing development that's a gated community. And the people who now live locked in that community have this false notion that somehow they're living in some kind of security. It's equally socially divisive, but if you look at the statistics in terms of how many times an ambulance has been called and nobody knew the number to get in the gate and so on. But it's an interesting idea that once people who were locked in are now locked out, largely it's very unlikely that if you've had employment difficulties all your life related to mental health problems, you would never be able to afford to be locked in one of those buildings again.
I think that's
But-
a really interesting analogy what you've just said. And I also think it's interesting that you're talking about the past, but if we look at now, what about the Olympics and the Paralympics and the fact that they're an add-on at the end and they didn't have any funding left and there were all those discussions about whether it was going to go on. And I'll certainly take forward what you said about variability, because I like that.
Good.
It's all still happening now,
Thank
isn't
you.
it?